Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukrainians will not give their land to occupiers following US President Donald Trump's hint at territorial concessions to end the Ukraine war. Zelensky adds any solution without Ukraine would be against peace as Trump announces talks with Putin in Alaska. This comes as the Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke with the leaders of China, India and 3 ex-Soviet states about his contacts with the United States. Trump's administration had placed 50% tariffs on India over the purchase of Russian oil, with threats made for other nations doing the same. India's Air Force chief says the country shot down 5 Pakistani fighter jets and another military aircraft during clashes in May after the Pahalgam terror attack. Most were downed using Russian-made S-400 missiles with electronic tracking data confirming the strikes. Thousands have gathered in Nagasaki to mark the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombing, as the regional mayor warns that current global conflicts risk triggering a nuclear war. On this day in 1945, the United States dropped a 10,000-pound plutonium bomb, killing about tens of thousands of people. Syria will not participate in planned talks with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in Paris, according to Syria's state news agency. The government source cited a previous forum organized by the United States-backed SDF, calling it a violation of an agreed accord. UN Chief Antonio Guterres criticized Israel's plan to take control of Gaza City, calling it a dangerous escalation that would force Palestinians from their homes. Benjamin Netanyahu says his military is going to free Gaza from Hamas. Azerbaijan and Armenia sign a US-brokered peace deal during a meeting with President Donald Trump, aiming to boost economic ties and move towards full normalization after decades of conflict. The deal marks the first resolution of the conflict since the Cold War. Brazilian President Lula da Silva signed into law a bill easing environmental licensing rules but vetoed dozens of provisions. Nicknamed the Devastation Bill by environmentalists, it weakens environmental controls and gives states more power to issue licenses for new developments. 3 Thai soldiers were injured by a landmine while patrolling the border with Cambodia, days after the 2 countries agreed to a ceasefire. 1 soldier lost a foot and 2 others were injured in the incident near Sisaket and Phra Vihar provinces. We start this hour in Europe, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Ukraine will never give up its land to Russia, stressing that the country's constitution forbids any territorial concessions. His remarks come ahead of the planned 15th of August meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Zelensky has said that Kyiv is ready for genuine solutions to achieve peace, but warns that any agreement made without Ukraine's participation would be an agreement against peace. Listen in to what the Ukrainian president had to say.
Дарувати свою землю окупанту українці не будуть. Україна готова до реальних рішень, які можуть дати мир. Будь-які рішення, які проти нас, будь-які рішення, які без України, вони одночасно і рішення проти миру. Вони нічого не дадуть. Це мертві рішення. Вони ніколи не спрацюють.
We're now joined by Professor Veselin Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at the Jindal Global Law School. He joins us live from Bulgaria. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us here on NewsX World. A huge development today, a date now in Alaska for the President of Russia and the President of the United States meeting face to face. How significant, however, is Zelensky's categorical refusal to cede territory to Russia ahead of this meeting?
Absolutely fundamental statement by Zelensky, which basically nullifies the meeting in Alaska. The meeting in Alaska is a photo opportunity of two narcissists. Putin and Trump want to have a photo together that will have a zero effect on any peace deal. Actually, the opposite. That meeting in Alaska will prolong the war because Putin will feel encouraged to continue killing civilians in Ukraine. So absolutely no need, useless meeting in Alaska. Zelensky is absolutely right. Nothing will change. Ukraine will not give up a kilometer of its territory. And the other players, the European Union, the Canadians, the Australians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and many, many other peace-loving countries will deny any territorial concessions. Giving Russia any kilometer of Ukrainian territory means the end of the international law, the end of the United Nations Charter. It should not be allowed. This meeting in Alaska is, I will compare it as if Frank Delano Roosevelt is meeting Adolf Hitler in 1945. It's absolutely unnecessary meeting. Unless Donald Trump can bring together Zelensky and Putin, he should not meet Putin alone.
Professor Popovsky, we've obviously seen Donald Trump sway in his opinions on this matter. Do you see the pendulum swaying towards Putin once he meets face to face? And what precedent would it set if territory were transferred without Ukraine's consent after this meeting?
Well, there won't be territory deal in Alaska whatsoever. They can talk whatever they want to talk, but that will not mean anything. Zero development out of Alaska. I will not even watch it. I refuse to comment. Don't ask me to comment on that meeting again. I will not watch what happened on 15th of August. For me, this is not a news. This is a photo opportunity, absolutely useless, having zero effect on anything. However, if there is a dynamic later and Donald Trump tries to meet Putin and Zelensky together in a trilateral meeting, that could have some significance. Again, Ukraine is not going to surrender any kilometer of its territory, and most of the world will support that.
What would be the Ukraine's response, do you think, that if Russia and the United States agree on a deal? We obviously haven't seen that previously. We have, however, seen Ukraine and the US agree a plan for a 60-day truce, which Moscow, of course, rejected. What are your thoughts on the possibility that there could be a deal here, a plan for a deal at least, subject to Ukraine's approval, where it does see territory conceded to Russia on Ukraine's behalf?
Well, if we see a deal on ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, which goes back 6 months ago, it's nothing new. It was proposed by Donald Trump, it was accepted by Ukraine, it was rejected by Russia. So if we see a renewed ceasefire proposal acceptable by Russia, then we have a news from Alaska. Unless we see that any territorial discussions without Ukraine on the table are useless. There is no deal between Russia and United States. These are only two countries in the world. There are 193 countries in the world. Two countries, Russia and United States, cannot make an agreement for the territory of any other of the 191 countries in the world, members of the United Nations. Absolutely impossible. This is something that should not be allowed. It's something that should not happen. Trump and Putin cannot discuss territorial issues. It's about Ukraine to be on the table and to agree on a ceasefire.
Professor Popovsky, thank you very much. You are staying with us to discuss further developments. We will obviously keep you posted in regards to any statements or events coming out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We stay in Europe for our next story, where US President Vice President J.D. Vance, who is currently in the UK, has challenged Britain's plan, which aims to recognise a Palestinian state if Israel fails to meet conditions by September. Speaking alongside Foreign Secretary David Lammy at Chevening House, Vance says that Washington has no such plans and stressed the lack of a functional Palestinian government. Let's listen in to him closely.
Well, it's one of the things that we're going to talk about. Obviously, the United Kingdom is going to make its decision. We have no plans to recognize a Palestinian state. I don't know what it would mean to really recognize a Palestinian state, given the lack of a functional government there. You know, what the president has made very clear is our two goals are very simple right now vis-a-vis the situation in Israel and Gaza. Number one, we want to make it so that Hamas cannot attack innocent Israeli civilians ever again, and we think that has to come through the eradication of Hamas. Second, the president has been very moved by these terrible images of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, so we want to make sure that we solve that problem. I mean, we've been in constant negotiations and conversations, even the last 24 hours, about how to get more aid into Gaza, about how to solve that humanitarian problem, and also how to get Hamas to a position where they can't continue to threaten the citizens and the civilians of Israel. So there's a lot of work to do there. There's a lot of common objectives here. There is some, I think, disagreement about how exactly to accomplish those common objectives. But look, it's a tough situation. Of course, we're not going to know exactly how to solve a very complicated problem. As the president has said himself, people in some ways have been fighting for thousands of years. If it was easy to bring peace to that region of the world, it would have been done already.
Following this, Lammy expressed concern over Israel's intentions to take more control of Gaza. He called for a ceasefire and the release of hostages. Both leaders said that they share common goals but differ on the path forward. We're once again joined by Professor Popovsky. What does this statement mean by J.D. Vance? How do you analyse it? That he doesn't know what it would mean to recognise a Palestinian state with no current functional government. What is your analysis, Professor Popovsky, on the two different approaches by the United Kingdom and the United States of America on this current situation in the Middle East?
Well, we see two statements, and you're right, Thomas, they are very different. From one very incompetent vice president, and on the other hand, one very competent British foreign secretary. And obviously, the issue of recognition of Palestinian state is in the minds of most of the civilized countries. Most of the European countries would like to do that. There is nothing new again. Palestinian state was recognized by the United Nations General Assembly back in 1948. Palestinians should have their statehood already established. The problem is all the conflict since then, which is still not resolved. And what J.D. Vance is saying, that we cannot recognize a state which have no functional government, which partially is correct. However, that recognition is important, even as symbolic as such, as to simply remind Israel that Palestinian state should exist. There is no resolution of this conflict without a Palestinian state to come to existence at some point. Might not happen next month, might not happen next year, but it should happen at some point for the conflict to be resolved. So what David Lammy is saying, that we will recognize Palestine. He doesn't give a specific date for that. And what J.D. Vance is saying is that we, kind of surprisingly for him, there is such an issue of recognition, because he doesn't know the history, he doesn't know the United Nations decisions back in 1948 and so on.
Yes, Professor Popovsky. We now move on to a related development to discuss further. According to reports, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is meeting Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani in Ibiza today to discuss a ceasefire proposal aimed at ending the war in Gaza and securing the release of hostages held by Hamas. The proposal is expected to be presented to Israel and Hamas within the next 2 weeks. However, the same report has stated that an Israeli official warned that the gap between Israel and Hamas on ending the conflict remains too wide for a comprehensive deal at this time. The talks come as the Israeli cabinet approved a plan to fully occupy Gaza City, raising international concerns over humanitarian impacts and hostage safety. The US had pulled negotiators from the ceasefire talks in July, blaming Hamas for blocking progress. Dr. Popovsky, given the reported gap between Israel and Hamas and the current state of ceasefire negotiations, as much as we know, what are the realistic chances of this proposal leading to a breakthrough in this unusual venue of Ibiza for the Qatari and the US envoys?
Yes, Thomas, very little chances. Your question is rhetorical. It already signals the skepticism of yet another meeting to achieve ceasefire in Gaza between Witkoff, who is not a solid diplomat. He's a transactional businessman. He doesn't know what the conflict is about. He's useless, as Donald Trump is useless in Alaska. But anyway, let's hope. We always approach such meetings with some hopes that they can bring some dynamics to the resolution of the conflict, although you correctly pointed, Thomas, that the Israeli government is not willing for ceasefire. They're actually talking about occupation of the Gaza Strip and effectively governing the Gaza Strip, no mentioning until when. So again, I would not expect much from this meeting in Qatar.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us here on the programme. Pleasure to get your insight, as always. We now move over to the United States, where a police officer has been killed after a gunman opened fire outside the headquarters of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Authorities say that at least 4 CDC buildings were struck by bullets, but no employees were injured. The shooter was later found dead in a nearby building, armed with multiple firearms. His motive so far remains unknown. The fallen officer, David Rose, was a Marine Corps veteran and a recent police academy graduate. CDC staff will work remotely on Monday as a security review is carried out. Georgia's governor praised first responders for their swift action. Meanwhile, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens says that no civilians were injured, while calling for a national reflection of the rise in mass shootings. Listen in to what the mayor of the city had to say.
At this time, there have been no civilian casualties, but this was an active shooter incident. The shooter is now deceased. The campus is, there are no threats on the campus currently, but we still have an active investigation. Atlanta Police Department will be the investigating party. And so we ask that while things are safe, that you don't drive in that part of campus, because we need to make sure that the investigation goes through without any obstruction.
We're now joined by Andrew Latham, who's a professor of international relations. He joins us live from Minnesota. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Pleasure to have you on. This is the second shooting that's happened today. Another shooting has also occurred in New York City, in Times Square, with 3 people injured. How does this incident fit into the broader trend of mass shootings in the United States?
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. There's a couple of things going on in this country, which the intersection of which gives rise to these shooting incidents. One of which, obviously, is the enabling reality that guns are readily available. All sorts of guns, from handguns to assault weapons, basically, readily available on the streets and in stores around this country. So that's an enabling factor. But what is the driving factor behind many of these mass shootings? Well, they vary. Some of them are politically motivated, some of them are psychologically motivated, and some of them are both at the same time. And this seems to be one of those cases where it's both at the same time. This now dead shooter seemed to have had psychological issues. His father reported him earlier in the day as being suicidal. And I'm sure that as the investigation unfolds, his various pathologies, psychological conditions will be revealed. But he also had a political motive in that he blamed the COVID vaccine for his medical conditions, which apparently were in decline. And so he wanted retribution. So of course he went to the Center for Disease Control, which was in his mind at least the center of the problem of mass inoculations, which caused, in his mind, twisted as it is, mass illnesses. And there's a third element which has to be considered here as well, which we'll discover over time, this phenomenon of death by cop. If you are actually suicidal and don't think for whatever reason that you can pull the trigger, you put yourself in the line of fire so that you have a police officer pull the trigger for you, as it were. And that seems to have been the case here. So complicated situation, both psychological and sociological, and that's where we are today.
Andrew, you of course insinuated there that part of the suspects' aim were political in this attack. What's your analysis of the rise of political violence and the state of political violence, the continuation of political violence in the United States currently?
Well, again, a couple of factors at play, one of which is radical polarization. It used to be that people could interact with people on the other side of any given political debate. They had friends on the other side of that political debate. The other side was humanized in that respect. And that has undergone a radical change over the last 10, 15 years. And we have essentially two silos now, a right-leaning, often evangelical, certainly pro-Trump silo, if you like, and on the other hand, a very progressive, anti-Trump, liberal silo on the other side, and never the two shall speak. And so it's easier once you've demonized the other in that way, it's easier to carry out these kinds of attacks. So that's one thing that's going on. And then there's also been a politicization in the sense that a large chunk of Americans no longer have faith in government. That can be local government, state government, but especially federal government, which can be quite distant and which is perceived to be the enemy. So when things go pear-shaped in this country, when things go wrong, people with the sociological and psychological guardrails have gone away, which enables them to acquire these easily accessed weapons and make what they think is a profound political statement. And that often involves attacking the institutions, the CDC in this case, but often the police. But very often it is just random. It is an attack on the other, and that can be just average, everyday human beings who don't share your views or whom you perceive don't share your views on this big political topic or that big political topic.
Andrew, some brilliant insight there. Thank you very much for that. Do stay with us as we discuss further updates from the United States. We move on now, where President Trump has demanded a $1 billion fine from the prestigious University of California system as his administration pressed its allegations of anti-Semitism over UCLA's response to 2024 student protests related to the war in Gaza. The amount, 5 times what Columbia University paid to resolve similar federal anti-Semitism claims, would completely devastate the UC public university system, a senior official has said on the matter. President James Milliken, who oversees the University of California's 10 campuses, including UCLA in Los Angeles, said the administration received the $1 billion demand on Friday and currently are reviewing it. He said, as a public university, taxpayer resources are being managed by the US, and our nation's leading public university system would be severely damaged and significant harm would be inflicted on our students and all Californians by a payment of this magnitude. That's a statement there. We're once again joined by Andrew Latham to discuss this further. Andrew, what is your analysis of Trump's prosecution and demands that universities claim responsibility for anti-Semitism on their campus over protests over the war in Gaza? Donald Trump obviously is an advocate for free speech. What do you say to critics that are saying that they are simply exercising their First Amendment that's written in the American Constitution?
Well, there is something to that. There's often two or more sides to these sorts of debates. If you recall, the presidents of various universities were called before Congress last year and again this year, and basically admitted that they had fallen short when it came to protecting the rights of Jewish identifying students on their campuses. I would remind your viewers that back in 2024, there was a moment of moral panic in this country around the Gaza situation, and the normal political and social guardrails came down on campuses, and there was a lot of overt and covert anti-Semitism manifesting itself. Now, the question is, what's the resolution to that? Do you simply haul those university and college presidents on the carpet and say, tisk, tisk, don't do that again. Adhere to your own rules and standards and norms, which prevent this kind of activity? Or do you engage in this kind of punitive and retributive policy of withholding federal funds or claiming back federal funds? There are two kinds of higher education institutions in the U.S., one of which is private. That's the place I work at, Macalester College. We receive federal funds to support research and student loans, et cetera, but we're not owned by the state government. And the University of California system is the largest public university. It is owned by the state of California. Trump has been emboldened. Every other institution of higher education that he's gone after has paid up. And it's like with respect to geopolitics, India is not rolling over, but Japan and the European Union, et cetera, rolled over on his tariff demands. And that's the way he works. He thinks if he gets his way on cases A, B, and C, he ought to get his way on cases X, Y, and Z. And this University of California system has fallen into the Z category for him. And it remains to be seen if they can afford to pay that. $1 billion US is a lot of money. And what kind of impact that will have in terms of student prospects, in terms of medical research, in terms of all sorts of research. $1 billion taken out of that public system potentially could have catastrophic consequences, but it would also clearly signal to the rest of higher education, you've got to take your obligations to minority students, including Jewish students, very, very seriously.
What are your thoughts towards Donald Trump's attitudes over the protests at universities, over the war in Gaza? Obviously, they're very skeptical of Israel in these protests. We've obviously seen Mahmoud Khalil detained, deportation threats. We've seen wars against, some would say, America's finest educational establishment, Harvard University. How would you analyze Donald Trump's approach to the education system when it comes to these protests?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think he understands American higher education. He has been a beneficiary of it. He has several degrees. I mean, he knows what it's like to be at one of these institutions. But he's also a very binary thinker, and he has placed these institutions of higher education into the bad category, the category of institutions that need radical reform. And he's also, it's been said many, many times, but I'll say it again, very transactional in his thought processes. He looks at these institutions and he says, you will jump this high or else. And if they don't jump that high, then he pulls out the stick and starts whacking them. And that's what's going on here. Other institutions like Harvard, like Princeton, like Yale, have basically, after protesting a little bit, rolled over and given him what he wanted. And again, I think that's emboldened him to go after, not in terms of prestige, but in terms of money, bigger fish. And he's certainly going after some of the biggest fish in this case. I said earlier that higher education in this country gave in to a moment of moral panic, which was radical overreaction, in which the normal guardrails went away. I think that's true on Trump's side as well. It used to be that the federal government would fund higher education, and otherwise it was hands off because academic freedom, freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. And those guardrails seem to have evaporated, evanesced. And Trump feels that it's within his purview, it's within his right as president to browbeat these higher education institutions into submission so that they conform to his vision of what higher ed should look like, what academic freedom entails, and what freedom of speech does and doesn't involve.
Andrew Latham, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Pleasure to have you on the programme. Well, unfortunately, that's all that we have time for, but we will continue to keep you updated on news updates from around the world. Thank you for joining us.